Imagine you are a soldier. You have fought on one of the deadliest battlefields in human history. You have survived poison gas. You have watched your friends die right next to you. You have seen things no human being should ever see. And then one morning, your commanding officer calls you in. He slides a piece of paper across the table. You pick it up. You read 2 words: Canadian sector. And something happens inside you that no military training ever prepared you for. You are afraid. Not the kind of afraid that makes you careful. The kind of afraid that makes grown men beg. This is not a story about Canada winning battles. Every army wins some battles. This is a story about something far more dangerous. This is a story about how one group of soldiers made their enemies lose the will to fight before the battle even started. This is the story of how Canadian soldiers broke the German army, not just physically, but psychologically. And why German officers, battle-hardened veterans who had fought on the brutal Eastern Front, got down on their knees and begged, please, anywhere but there. Stay with me, because the answer is not what you think. To understand the fear, you first need to understand what Canada was in 1914. Canada was not a military superpower. It was not even close. It had no real standing army. It had no battle-tested generals. It had no tradition of war that stretched back centuries like Germany or Britain did. What it had was land, endless land, forests, farms, fishing villages, and small towns spread across millions of square miles. And the men who lived on that land were farmers, lumberjacks, fishermen, miners, men who worked with their hands every single day, men who knew how to survive in brutal conditions, men who had spent their whole lives in the cold, in the wilderness, doing hard things because hard things were the only things available.
Quickly now, men.
When Britain asked Canada to send soldiers to World War I, these were the men who showed up.
Is counting on you.
No one took them seriously. Germany certainly didn't. German military intelligence had a word for colonial troops. They called them Kanonenfutter. It means cannon fodder, bodies to fill trenches, numbers to absorb bullets while the real war fought the real war. The German High Command looked at the Canadian Expeditionary Force and saw farmers holding rifles. They expected them to break. They expected them to run. They expected them to be nothing. Germany was wrong, and they would spend the next 4 years paying for that mistake in blood and in something far worse, in fear. The year is 1915. The Western Front is not a battlefield. It is a grave that hasn't been covered yet. Hundreds of miles of trenches cut across France and Belgium. Mud so deep men drown in it. Rats the size of cats. Bodies that never get recovered. The smell of decay everywhere. Both sides are stuck. Neither side can break through. This is the reality of trench warfare. You can die easily, but you cannot win easily. And into this nightmare walks the Canadian Corps. They arrive raw. They arrive untested. They arrive with weapons that sometimes don't work and boots that fall apart in the mud. But here is the key thing about these men. They are not there because a government drafted them. They volunteered. Every single one of them chose to cross an ocean and enter hell. That choice matters more than you know. When a man chooses to be somewhere, he fights differently than a man who was forced there. He has already decided the cost is worth paying. He has already made peace with the worst possible outcome. The German soldiers they faced were professional, trained, disciplined. They followed orders. The Canadian soldiers they faced were something harder to define. They were men who had already decided they would not stop. And in the trenches of World War I, that difference, that one difference, meant everything.
Let's be honest about what the Canadian soldiers were up against. The German army in World War I was not some weak enemy. Germany had the best trained military force in the world at that time. Their generals had studied warfare for decades. Their soldiers drilled for years before ever seeing a battlefield. Their weapons were often more advanced than anything the Allies had. Against this machine, Canada sent volunteers, men who had been trained for months, not years, men who were still learning how to be soldiers while they were being shot at. And it was not just the German army they faced. They faced poison gas, a weapon no one had ever used in war before. They faced artillery barrages that lasted for days. They faced winter temperatures that froze the water in their canteens. They faced diseases that spread through the trenches like fire. They faced something else too. They faced doubt. The world watched Canada and waited for them to fail. Britain did not fully trust them. Some British generals saw Canadian officers as amateurs who needed supervision. Canada was still a young country. It had not yet proven itself on the world stage. Every day in the trenches was a test, and the weight of that test, of having to prove yourself while also trying to survive, is a pressure that would crush most people. But it did not crush the Canadians. It sharpened them. And what happened next at a place called Ypres made the entire world stop and take notice.
April 22, 1915. Second Battle of Ypres, Belgium. It is late afternoon. The sun is starting to go down. And then something impossible happens. A yellow-green cloud appears across no man's land. It moves slowly. It drifts toward the Allied trenches. Chlorine gas. The German army has just unleashed a weapon the world has never seen used in war. There are no gas masks. No one has prepared for this. No one even knows what it is at first. French and Algerian troops on the left flank see the cloud coming. They do what any rational human being would do in that situation. They run. Thousands of them leave their positions and flee. This creates a massive gap in the Allied line, 4 miles wide, completely open. If the Germans push through, they could collapse the entire front. Now, picture this gap. Picture the green cloud. Picture men choking and falling. Picture the German advance beginning. And picture right next to that gap the Canadian soldiers. They had 2 options. Option 1, follow the French and run. Any reasonable commander would have ordered a retreat. The flank was gone.
The gas was coming. There was no shame in pulling back. Option 2. Hold. The Canadians chose option 2. With no gas masks, they soaked cloths in water. Some accounts say they used their own urine because it was available, and the ammonia helped neutralize the chlorine. And they pressed those cloths to their faces. And they charged into the gas toward the Germans. Think about what that means. Think about the level of courage or stubbornness or determination, call it whatever you want, that it takes to run toward a poison gas cloud. They held the line. The gap was closed. The German advance was stopped. The reports that went back to German headquarters were unusual. The word that kept appearing was unexpected. These colonial troops had done something no one anticipated. They had not broken. It was the first time, but it would not be the last. To understand why the Canadians fought the way they did, you need to understand one thing about who they were. They were not soldiers who were following orders. They were men who were protecting each other. Most of them came from small communities, towns where everyone knew everyone. Some of them were brothers, literally. Many of them had grown up together, worked together, gone to the same church together. When they arrived in France, they were not just fighting for a country or a flag or an idea. They were fighting for the man standing next to them, the man they had known their whole life, the man whose family they knew by name. That changes everything about how you fight. When a professional soldier loses a comrade, it is a loss. It is painful, but it happens in war and you move on because the mission continues. Tragically, when a Canadian soldier watched his childhood friend die 3 feet away from him, something happened in his mind that no military handbook covers. The grief turned into something hard, something cold, something that did not go away. German prisoners later described the experience of fighting Canadians with a strange phrase. They said the Canadians fought like they had nothing to lose. They were partly right, but it was more specific than that. The Canadians fought like men who had already lost something, and they were making sure it meant something. The German army was trained. The Canadian army was motivated. And in the grinding, bloody reality of trench warfare, motivation is often the last thing standing when training runs out. By 1916, the Canadians had developed a reputation. But reputation alone does not break an army. What happened next took that reputation and turned it into something that lived inside the German soldiers' heads like a nightmare they could not wake up from. It was called raiding. Trench raiding was not a Canadian invention. Both sides did it. Small groups of soldiers would cross no man's land at night, enter the enemy trenches, grab prisoners for intelligence, and come back. But the Canadians took raiding to a different level entirely. They trained for it obsessively. They rehearsed every detail. They learned to move through the dark in complete silence. They studied the German trench layouts until they knew them better than some of the German soldiers who lived in them. And then they went out night after night. Here is what made it psychologically devastating. It was not just the raids themselves, it was the uncertainty. German soldiers would go to sleep in their trenches, and some of them would not wake up. Not because of artillery, not because of a major attack, just gone, vanished, no sound, no warning. 3 soldiers sitting together at midnight. By 3 in the morning,
Two of them had disappeared, and the third one had heard nothing. A German soldier's diary, recovered after the war, contained a line that historians have quoted many times. He wrote, "We do not look toward the Canadian lines at night. The ones who look do not see the morning." That is fear. Not fear of dying in battle. That is the deeper kind of fear. The kind that lives in the silence. The kind that makes you afraid to look out into the dark. The German High Command began receiving reports from units stationed opposite the Canadians. The reports described something that commanders rarely want to admit. Their soldiers were not sleeping. They were not eating properly. They were jumpy, anxious, and exhausted, not from battle, from waiting for a battle that might come from anywhere, at any time, with no warning. The Canadians had not just won fights, they had colonized the imagination of their enemy.
Here is the great irony at the heart of this story. The German army thought the Canadians were savage, undisciplined, wild. They thought these farmers and lumberjacks fought without rules because they didn't know any better, because they were unsophisticated. They were completely wrong. The AREP, by 1917, was arguably the most well-organized and tactically sophisticated fighting force on the Western Front. Their commanders spent enormous time and energy thinking about every detail. They shared information between units in ways that other armies didn't. They adapted quickly. They learned from every mistake. The famous night raids were not chaos, they were choreography. Carefully planned, precisely executed. Every man knew exactly what to do. The Canadians did not fight without rules. They rewrote the rules.
Captain.
And no one on the German side understood this, which meant they could never properly counter it. Analyzing, they kept preparing for a wild, undisciplined attack. What they got instead was a wild, highly disciplined attack. And that combination, ferocity plus precision, is something the military mind struggles to defend against. You can build walls against an enemy you understand. You cannot build walls against an enemy who keeps becoming something different every time you think you have figured them out. This misunderstanding would cost Germany enormously, nowhere more than at a place German soldiers had once considered completely safe. Vimy Ridge, a long, gentle slope in northern France. From the top, you could see for miles across the battlefield. Whoever held Vimy Ridge held a massive tactical advantage. Germany had held it since 1914. They had spent 2 years turning it into a fortress. Underground tunnels, deep bunkers, layers of barbed wire, machine gun positions designed to cover every angle of approach. France had tried to take it. They failed.
Just get her cooled down and
Thousands
patched up.
died.
We need her flying by morning.
Britain had tried to take it. They failed. More thousands died. By April 1917, Vimy Ridge had a reputation. It was the kind of place that breaks armies, the kind of objective that looks easy on a map and destroys you in reality. German soldiers stationed there had started to feel genuinely safe. They had watched 2 of the world's great armies come apart on that slope. They drank coffee and watched the Allied lines through their binoculars and felt, if not invincible, at least very well defended. Then the Canadians were given the assignment. What happened next is a masterclass in preparation, and it begins with something almost boring: planning. Canadian Corps Commander Arthur Currie did something unusual. He shared the plan with everyone. Every single soldier, not just the officers, knew the exact objective, the exact route, the exact timing. In most armies of that era, ordinary soldiers were told to go forward and follow orders. Curry gave his men maps. He gave them models of the terrain. He had them rehearse the attack on a full-scale replica of the ridge built behind the lines. They rehearsed for weeks. Every soldier walked through what he would do. Every unit knew what the unit next to it was doing. If a leader was killed, the next man could take over without hesitation because every man already knew the whole plan. At 5:30 in the morning of April 9th, 1917, the Canadian Corps attacked. All 4 divisions, simultaneously. For the first time in Canadian military history, every Canadian unit attacked together as one force. The assault was precise. It was overwhelming. It was like nothing the German defenders had ever seen. Within 4 hours, the Canadians had taken ground that had resisted 2 years of Allied effort. Within a day, Vimy Ridge had fallen. The German soldiers who surrendered that morning were not the same men who had watched the previous Allied attacks with quiet confidence. They were shaken, confused. Some of them could not explain what had happened. One German officer, in his post-battle report, wrote something that has been remembered ever since. He wrote that the Canadians attacked with a method and a ferocity he had not believed was possible together. He used a German word, Sturmtruppen, stormtroopers, but he said these were something beyond that. He didn't have a word for what they were. Back in Berlin, the reports from Vimy Ridge changed something in how the German High Command thought about the Canadian Corps. They stopped seeing them as colonial troops who had gotten lucky. They started treating them as a primary threat. That shift in thinking had a consequence no one expected.
At some point in 1917 and into 1918, something remarkable began to happen within the German military command structure. Word spread quietly through reports and dispatches and conversations between officers that the Canadian Corps was different, not just better, different in a way that affected the men who faced them before the battle even began. German units that learned they would be facing Canadians experienced something commanders noticed and did not know how to address. Morale dropped, not because the men were cowards. These were veterans, men who had survived years of brutal warfare. But the specific knowledge that Canadians were coming produced a particular kind of dread. Historically, there is documentation of the German High Command making specific decisions about which units to place opposite the Canadian Corps. The reasoning was stark. Placing elite German units against the Canadians was considered wasteful, not because the elite units were expected to lose, but because the psychological cost of facing the Canadians was too high, even for the best soldiers. Let that sit for a moment. The German army was essentially saying, our best soldiers are too valuable to have their morale destroyed by the Canadians. Send the units that are already struggling. Think about what that reveals. The Germans were not just afraid of losing battles to the Canadians, they were afraid of what fighting the Canadians did to a soldier's mind. They had seen it happen too many times. A unit goes in confident, a unit comes out broken, not always in body, but in spirit. And once a soldier's spirit is broken, it takes far more than rest to fix. By 1918, there were stories circulating among German troops that historians have verified through diaries and post-war testimonies.
German soldiers would hear that Canadian units were moving into the sector next to them, and they would begin quietly to prepare not for battle, but for the worst. Some wrote letters home that night, letters that read like goodbyes. Some prayed, men who had not prayed in years. Some simply sat very still and said nothing. Concludingly, the Canadians had achieved something armies spend centuries trying to achieve and almost never do. They had won a war of the mind before a single shot was fired.
August 8th, 1918. The last chapter of World War I begins. The Allied forces launch what historians call the 100 Days Offensive. It is the final push. The plan is to break the German lines completely and end the war. And at the tip of that spear, placed there deliberately by Allied Commander Field Marshal Douglas Haig himself, is the Canadian Corps. Haig understood something clearly by this point. When the line needed to break, you sent the Canadians, not because they were the only capable force, but because their presence alone changed the equation. Their reputation preceded them like a shock wave. On that morning of August 8th, in the space of a single day, the Canadian Corps advanced 8 miles. 8 miles in one day on the Western Front, where armies had been fighting and dying for years over distances measured in yards. German General Erich Ludendorff, one of the most powerful commanders in the German military, called August 8th the Black Day of the German Army. He was not referring to the losses alone. He was referring to what the losses revealed, that the German army no longer had the will to resist. And at the center of that Black Day were the Canadians. What followed over the next 100 days confirmed what the German High Command had feared for years. When Canadian units appeared on a section of the front, German resistance collapsed faster than anywhere else. Prisoners were taken not because they were surrounded, but because they stopped fighting. There are accounts from this period of German soldiers surrendering to Canadian units before any shots were fired. They had heard who was coming. They had made a decision. Not to fight, not to run, just to stop. This is what psychological defeat looks like. The body is still present. The weapons are still loaded, but something inside has already given up. The Canadians did not just win battles in the 100 days. They ended them before they started. So we return to the question that started this story. Why did German officers beg not to be sent to face the Canadians? The simple answer is that the Canadians were extraordinarily effective soldiers who had developed tactics, training, and a fighting spirit that made them genuinely dangerous. But the simple answer is not the true answer. The true answer has to do with something harder to name. The German army was professional. It was institutional. Its soldiers followed orders because that is what soldiers do in a professional army. The system worked until it stopped working, and then the soldiers looked for new orders. The Canadian soldiers followed something different. They followed each other. Their loyalty was not to an institution, it was to the men standing beside them. That kind of loyalty does not stop working. It cannot be bombed or gassed or outmaneuvered. When a Canadian soldier pushed forward into impossible conditions, he was not following an order. He was refusing to let the man next to him down. He was refusing to let the death of his friend mean nothing. German soldiers felt this, not in any mystical way. They felt it in the way you feel when you look into another person's eyes and understand that nothing you do will make them stop coming. That is not a tactical problem. That is an existential one. And there is no military manual that tells you how to respond to an enemy who will not stop, because stopping would mean admitting that the price they already paid was pointless. The Canadians fought with the weight of their dead behind them, and that weight somehow made them harder to stop than anything the German army had prepared to face.
We started this story with a German colonel in a bunker, his hands shaking, a telegram in front of him. 2 words: Canadian sector. Now you understand what was in his mind. He was not afraid of dying. Soldiers accept death. They are trained to accept death. He had made peace with that possibility years ago. He was afraid of something worse. He was afraid of what it felt like to stand across from men who had already decided the cost didn't matter. He was afraid of looking into the eyes of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. He had seen what happened to his colleagues who ended up in that sector. He had read the reports. He had heard the stories. Men who came back changed. Men who couldn't explain what had happened. Men who had faced professional armies their entire careers and never looked shaken, but who, after the Canadian sector, never quite recovered. After the war, the Allies conducted interviews with German prisoners and former officers. One interview, conducted in 1919, asked a former German officer a simple question. When were you most afraid during the war? The man paused for a long time. He had survived 4 years of combat. He had been at some of the most terrible battles in human history. He thought carefully. And then he said, "The night before we knew Canadians were coming, no one slept. Some men prayed. I had not prayed since I was a child, but that night I prayed too." That is what the Canadians did. They did not just beat their enemies on the battlefield. They haunted them.
Here is the last thing you need to know, the thing that changes everything that came before it. Canada entered World War I as a young country with no real identity on the world stage. No one took it seriously. No one expected anything from it. It was a colony that sent men to fight in someone else's war. By the end of the war, Canada had a reputation that no one could ignore. The Canadian Corps was considered among the finest fighting forces in the world. Canadian commanders were respected. Canadian tactics were studied. The transformation was real and complete. But here is the price of that transformation. Canada lost more than 60,000 soldiers in World War I. In 1914, Canada's entire population was around 8 million people. Do the math. 1 in every 133 Canadians Men, women, and children did not come home from that war. Every Canadian family was touched. Every town lost sons. Every community buried people who should have grown old. When we ask why the Canadians fought with such ferocity, the answer is not complicated. They fought the way they fought because they were men who understood loss, because they had watched friends die and kept going, because turning back meant that those deaths counted for nothing. They were fearless, not because they did not understand danger. They were fearless because they had already paid the highest price there is, and they were not going to let it mean nothing. Today, Vimy Ridge in France is Canadian soil. The French government gave it permanently to Canada after the war. On that ridge stands a memorial, 2 white towers reaching into the sky, carved with the names of more than 11,000 Canadians who died in France with no known grave. Every year, people go there. They stand at those towers. They look out over the land that was taken in 4 hours on one cold April morning in 1917, and they try to imagine what it felt like to be there. Some things cannot be fully imagined. They can only be respected. The German officers who begged not to be sent to the Canadian sector were not weak men. They were experienced soldiers who had learned something real.
All secure, sir.
They had
Running
learned
rich.
that
All
there
right,
is
let's get her
one
up.
thing harder to fight than a well-trained army. A group of
Chocks
people
away!
who have
Good luck,
decided
skipper.
that the cost
Keep her
of
steady.
stopping is higher than the cost of continuing. Canada did not just become a nation on those battlefields. It became a warning.